Hello and welcome to Access Chat. Today it's just me from the Access Chat team because Debra's out celebrating her wedding anniversary. Have a great day off, Debra, and Antonio is working. Heaven forbid us stopping from people from working. So today's guest is someone that I've known for a very long time. It's Andy Black, and Andy is a business engagement and accessibility specialist at the Department for Education. He's here in his personal capacity, but I've known Andy as a person passionate about technology and education and the power for tech to do good things for well over a decade since before I was working in my current job. So welcome, Andy. It's great to have you with us.
Yeah, hi Neil. I think it's probably longer than 10 years if I really add it up. I think it's probably nearer 15. I think it is probably, if I'm really honest about it. Yeah, great. Thea, thanks for having me on, really.
Yeah.
I better tell a little bit about myself, I suppose, hadn't I? Yeah, usual stuff. I'm first thing to say is I'm a dyslexic dyspraxic. Only recently diagnosed, but it's been written large throughout my whole of my working life. So I'm 58 now, was diagnosed at 54. Mainly out of interest, but I've got a lifelong interest in lots of different stuff. So obviously technology, learning and inclusion, really. My background is teaching, and I've gone from teaching in further education colleges, working with quite specialist people going on a specialist training around nature conservation and that kind of stuff, but also with students with specific learning difficulties and that kind of stuff. And I think I've just been on a bit of a journey with tech. And for me, tech personally is a bit of life support. You know, I spent 30 years hiding my dyslexia by using spell check and grammar checker with obvious amusing results. We all know that spell checker in the early days was quite an amusing thing. But I've got an interest in quite a lot of stuff. And my big thing is I'm just passionate about that use of technology and maybe letting people use technology in ways that it wasn't designed to do, but use it in creative ways. So a long time ago now, it must be the mid 2005, 2006, I did some work with BSL, British Sign Language, on iPod Touches, when iPod Touches were the new thing. I am that old. And that kind of stuff. I've also got a bit of an interest also in things. My late mother had slow onset motor neurone disease, so I'm really interested, and sadly passed away after a 10-year episode of motor neurone disease, which is a long time for motor neurone disease, or for your American listeners, ALS. And I'm passionately interested in communication tools. So around how that technology can help people communicate and engage with people. And I think it's just an interesting area. And I think we just live in exceptional times, really. Don't ask me. Sorry, carry on.
No. So equally interested in communication tools, and actually just to flag up in a few weeks' time, we've actually got someone coming on that will be talking about communication tools and care robots and all of this kind of stuff. So watch this space on that one.
Yeah, so I mean, I did a lot of work in the early days with mobile phones and working with primarily with deaf learners around. I had the most amazing experience of one of the most amazing experiences of my life of being away with a party of students that were deaf, who started the way the way they were using SMS to communicate. Do anybody on the call remember SMS? It's that old technology now, I suppose. But it was the one thing that really lit my bonfire. And I did some very early work on basically integrating various what were, I don't know what we call them, timetabling platforms, I suppose. So basically to text students what we thought we did initially for deaf students, to say when room changes, because if you turn up for a room and somebody's told you about it and you miss the message or whatever, you aren't able to lip read, or it's in a very noisy environment. I then discovered within about 40 minutes of introducing it, there were loads of students signing up to the same service because they basically were using it as a way of being digitally organized rather than digitally chaotic. Which I think is quite an interesting one, really.
So SMS is still a powerful tool even today, and it's amazing. I think back sort of 10, 12 years ago when I was working for Hearing System, we were dealing a lot with students. We would really struggle to get hold of them. and we'd be leaving answer phone messages and failing to get hold of people, and this would delay the deliveries and delay repairs and take up loads of people's time. And then we implemented an automated SMS tracking system which told people when their computer would be picked up, when it was being repaired, what the status was, when to expect it back. And it reduced the amount of effort tremendously, because what we found out was that most of the students actually had, even though they weren't deaf, they all used SMS because they had that bundled into their packages, and they were using pay-as-you-go mobile phones. This is before, data packages, so much. And they were being charged an extortionate amount to pick up voicemails, so they would never listen to them. So all of the messages that we were leaving behind saying, your computer's ready, can we send you your computer, it's all fine, never got listened to. As soon as we started implementing SMS, they were calling into us. So technology works in ways that you don't expect quite often. Yeah.
So Joe, it's quite interesting. Obviously, in this time of COVID being a terrible time for people, we've done a lot of work. I work currently in an organisation that runs a Microsoft Teams environment, and we've gone massive. We in the first few weeks of lockdown, we were running Skype for Business, and were just trialing Teams video and Teams voice calling, and we went over, and one of the things we've been using is auto captioning, which is that thing again, you think that's technology that only certain people will use for captions, and then we've discovered with loads of people, not just those that that there's a very hidden community in lots of organizations, that people that lip read sometimes without realizing it, so they need to lip read they've got some degree of hearing loss. But we also discovered loads of people that were maybe homeschooling children, were trying to do calls while effectively devices were on silent, were watching the thing. And I think that's a really interesting area, that develop of captioning. And we've been, that's using cognitive sort of voice services and the AI stuff, which AI is always viewed as big, bad and scary, which some aspects really are big, bad and scary. But there's some stuff around there that I think is going to be a real enabler. I think it's something we really want to, as a community, we want to hold people's feet to the fire is such in a nice way, so it doesn't discriminate, but in a way that can be a really positive tool, really. So some technologies there that I think that are going to change the lives of lots of people, but also people that require inclusion or accessible needs to a degree that I think can be viewed as quite positive. I think if we just make sure we get it right, it's quite interesting.
Yeah. So I think that the captioning stuff is really interesting. A few years ago, automatic captions weren't of great quality. What we've seen is that the quality has improved dramatically, and that the acceleration of that improvement has increased during COVID, because what we're seeing is all of these large companies, whether it be Microsoft or Google or for that matter, Teams using plugins, Zoom using plugins. There's a mass of people using these services now, and they're getting much better data, and they're able to analyze it and build better voice models. So it is rapidly improving, and I totally empathize with the people that are having to use captions because they've got Baby Shark going on in the background.
Yeah, exactly.
No one should suffer that.
I think what's interesting is that you're saying that idea is that huge amount of data that's flying in, of data modeling, and that's quite an interesting one to look at about how that's going to pan out and how that's going to work. And I think we've noticed it dramatically how much captions have improved with time. We've also noticed how there's some quite intelligent models coming around acronyms and abbreviations, because everybody loves it. If you work in government or you work in an organisation, they love abbreviations. We've know some really quite interesting work going around. So if you use a particular abbreviation regularly, it'll pick it up and that kind of stuff. But I think there's a lot more to work in that area. And I think the other thing that we've started to use quite a lot is, again, with video, the idea of just using blurred backgrounds and stuff. And I think that's remarkable, really. And that's an interesting one from an inclusion point of view. That's two different levels of inclusion. If you want a simple background because it helps you lip read, that's absolutely fine. But if you want to hide somebody from reading the password written on the back of your wall on the whiteboard, or critically look at your books behind you, and comment on your choice of books or your choice of wallpaper. It's just a choice, really.
Yeah. No, I think it's rapidly changing tech. That said, there is still something to be said for face-to-face contact. I know that I've found being on 10, 12 hours of Zoom calls and Teams calls and various different video calls day in, day out is actually quite wearing.
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of, as you know, there's been quite a lot of work on that, really, because I think lots of things, because people just don't put in gaps, and people don't allow to put in gaps, which is one. And also, I think the whole way that the internet, the internet, that's a terrible phrase, but the way the network of compresses audio and changes audio around, and the fact there is a slight delay on lips and voice, I think it is just really tiring. I really noticed Zoom fatigue, and we've developed some quite strong protocols in my team that work very closely with the teams, of saying, if you want your video on, have it on with somebody you don't know for the first time for a few minutes, or if it's somebody you know really well, if you don't need your video, don't turn it on. I think it is definitely more tiring to do a video call than it is to do a voice call. And that's me speaking personally. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't know. That's how I feel personally.
So I tend to agree with you. I will turn video on for presentations, for things like this, for initial meets, and then if it's people I know well, quite often I won't, because we know each other. We can pick up the sort of nuances in each other's voice. I'm interested to think about some of the stuff from an education point of view. We've obviously talked about people working from home, but the shift to education from home, I think it's probably even more extreme, in that wasn't something that was happening before. There was already a flexible working movement. What are the things that you've observed over the last few months in terms of innovation and accessibility, and to a certain extent lack of it in education?
I think what's really interesting is the fact that anybody that's working with young people or older people, be in a learning context or a youth context. I'm massively involved with working with young people outside of work, so scouts, outdoors activities. If you look at my bio on the web, you'll find that kind of stuff. I think there's been some really innovative stuff gone on. I think there's also been some stuff that has always gone on as trying to reproduce what you do in a classroom via paper packs or whatever online. But I think on the whole, I think what people have realized, and I've had some training myself, and this is speaking from a learning development point of view. I recently attended a training session where somebody tried to recreate a 9 to 5 face-to-face training session on a 9 to 5 online session. And if you want to try that as an experience, I don't recommend it, because even with breaks, that is just exhausting, and it just doesn't work, to be honest. So I think what is interesting, the fact is, and we've seen it with our own my own team and my own staff, is we've forgotten the fact is that broadband at home might be great for one person to use broadband, but if you get multiple people using the same broadband in the same place, you get a deterioration in quality. I have got to say, I'm pretty amazed at how well the UK networks have stood up to traffic. I'm not saying it's perfect, but if you look, I've only just seen the figures from looking at the growth of Teams calls or the use of Skype or whatever, and it's seven. In the first few weeks of lockdown, it was 700, 800% or more, and I think what's interesting is I think we've got a thing about, and I as you know, I started in the world of asynchronous learning, so online learning that was a bit asynchronous. So going back to, I want to say news groups, but I'm not that old really. Well, I am actually, but asynchronous chats, so posting up an idea and people corresponding, a bit like you and I use Twitter, really. Yes. We use Twitter. You put a question up, you'll go away, get on with your life, come back to it. I think there's something about how we use online tools in an asynchronous manner, which sounds like almost an anachronism, doesn't it, really, when we're thinking about being online all the time? But I don't think it is. I think it's a way of just giving people content or ideas, getting to go away, go outside, maybe collect content via mobile phones and video or whatever, and then feeding it back in that way.
And here's Antonio. It looks like he's managed to skive off in time. So welcome, Antonio.
Hi, Antonio.
Welcome.
So I think the idea of, and I'm old enough to have used news groups too, of the fact that we're a global community as well means that some of that asynchronousness is still relevant, because otherwise you're going to be trying to do everything in real time across the globe.
Well, I've got an amusing story for you. I made the mistake of being a keen person, saw an interesting event. Oh, Jenny Leigh Flurry of Microsoft was speaking at an event, so I signed up at 7 p.m. Central Time, and then realised it was 1 a.m. in the morning.
Yes.
And at the time, they haven't yet said if they've recorded it, but I have gone back to them and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I signed up, got a bit enthusiastic, and then realised it was 1 o'clock in the morning." And I.
Yes, well, yeah, we have quite a lot of that in sort of global organisations where, especially sort of where we're sat in the middle. So we've got people in India, so that their days are starting early, and it can mean for a very long day, especially if you're dealing with West Coast of America as well, because the sort of, you just don't stop. But yeah, these kind of things are, having the ability to record this stuff, is great. But how much do you think the proliferation of all of these recordings has just added to people's anxiety and FOMO? Because everybody's gone, I've got a blog now, I'm going to do a podcast, and
yeah, it's interesting. I stopped blogging it must be about 10 years ago, when I changed roles in a job, and I just stopped doing it. But it's quite interesting, because it's a bit like, I'm going to go back to the time when the times I first met you, when Twitter was a new thing.
Yes.
And I used to introduce loads of people to Twitter, and I pick up technologies really easy. It's just the nature of the person I am, being a little bit quirky, a little bit odd, off the ball, maverick, whatever you want to call it. But Twitter was the one medium that I looked at and I didn't get it to start with. And I always said to everybody, give it 3, and then it took me 3 weeks to get it, and then I got it. And the analogy I use with Twitter, and it has helped me cope actually with this multiple threads in life, is somebody told me, and it's not original, so I'd love to credit them, but I can't. But they describe Twitter as a river. You go swimming, you go for a swim in the river, come out, get dressed, get changed or whatever, and then get on with your normal life, and then go back into it. When you first look at Twitter, you assume that, if you're a person like myself, you want to read all of it.
Yeah.
It's a bit like those jokes of downloading the internet, I suppose, isn't it? Really, you describe it. And I think that's the thing that I don't have a massive fear of missing out. And I see it with other people, and I see it with people quite close to me who, and the effects of young people who pick up that FOMO fear, and older people, is quite interesting, really. I think it's just and the proliferation of tools and sources and recordings doesn't help, I don't think.
No. So I made the mistake when I first got Twitter of finding a plugin for Twitter for Outlook. And I sort of opened up my inbox the next morning, and there were 4,000 unread messages, and after about 2 weeks of it, I completely burned myself out and uninstalled the thing. So like you, I learned the hard way that you have to dip into this stuff.
No, that remembers me something that one of my old boss did in the areas before social media, where he was arriving to work. He saw a car in the car park with the lights on. Oh, and he arrived to work and decided to email to everyone within the list. Oh, there's a car in the park with the lights on. So it was overwhelmed for 3 months, getting reply emails. That's not mine. That's not mine. So sometimes we can be responsible ourselves for the overloads that are coming to us.
Yeah.
So I mean, we're seeing all of these we've talked about captioning, and captioning is powered by speech recognition and natural language processing, which is one of the technologies that I've used for a very long time. You said that you had a late diagnosis of dyslexia. What are the and that you covered it up through your use of technology, and you talked about spell checkers and stuff like that. What are the technologies that you're now adopting that you find to be useful?
That's a really interesting one, really. Okay, I'm a big user of Google in my private life, Gmail in my private life, and in work I'm a massive Microsoft person. So a big Microsoft user. So one of the things I'm in discussion with Microsoft. I use Accessibility Checker all the time. So I run it for me and I run it for them. I also do a lot of read aloud stuff. Loads of read aloud stuff, and it's quite interesting because we, like a lot of people, have used some products that are around from third-party products, but now I just tend to use things like read aloud in Edge or voiceover, the voiceover stuff on a Mac, and I think that's something that during the times of COVID, the tails of COVID, I think there's some technologies there that I use that other people have started to use because they've just got so much information, the ability to hear information read back to you. I think is one that I quite often use. My major tool for overcoming it is the fact I try and speak to people rather than written stuff, and I also am very lucky. I have a fantastic set of co-workers who I occasionally will do that very old school thing of emailing somebody and saying, before I send this, does this make sense? Because I still don't think we're there yet with some of the tools around, and I don't think I think it's going to be interesting how that goes. Really, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that goes. It is interesting, that idea of we've had some quite interesting debates about and I'm sure it's the same in the inclusion community about AI and privacy and data and everything like that. And if you talk to my 20-year-old who's just about to start an MSc in machine learning in STEM, he said, well, I assume I don't have any privacy, which is a pretty damning thing to say. But he's willing to give up some of his privacy for his digital convenience, I think. And then that's quite interesting, I think.
So and in terms of media consumption, books and text, are you using any particular tools in order to follow up in terms of trends? What is your favorite way of consuming this type of information?
Right. Okay. I have a very bad Twitter habit, as I describe it. So I use some of the search tools in Twitter pretty extensively and that kind of stuff. I also, during lockdown, much more so than I did before, I've actually started using LinkedIn, which is something I never really I would say I was present on LinkedIn, but I wasn't a resident. There's a great phrase by an academic called Dave White from who is now at Oxford University, I believe, and he used to describe people as the digital. I get really upset when people describe me as a digital native because I'm not a digital native, and I don't believe I don't want to upset people, but I don't believe in the term. My phrase is I think I'm digitally resident in some things. So and I'll just explain what that means. So the things where I'm really comfortable. So resident is when you visit somewhere and you're really comfortable. If you're and I'm not just a visitor. I just don't pop in and out. So Twitter, I am definitely resident in. YouTube, I'm a visitor, I suppose. And LinkedIn, I think I've just bought a holiday home in LinkedIn. Actually, I'm a bit resident and maybe popping in occasionally.
Yeah, I'd actually I use the concept of being naturalized.
Oh, I like that. I'll steal that. I will steal that if I may.
So I'm definitely not a digital native, but I have become naturalized, and in certain aspects of digital. So like you, yeah, very much a citizen of Twitterville, and have that holiday home in LinkedIn. But I think they're different communities, and very much. I mean, one of the reasons I really liked Twitter and why it maybe appeals to dyslexic people is the brevity of it. so it's short, digestible chunks. So for me, with ADHD and dyslexia, I can just about hold my attention to read the tweet, whereas with reading through the entirety of a blog, unless I'm listening to it and using tools, is much more difficult, because I'll sort of wander off.
Yeah, I mean, I have some fantastic friends who have just got a variety of access needs. I've got several, people with some things like dyslexia and dyspraxia, like myself. Some people that are either visually impaired, visually blind, or deaf, or whatever. And I just think it's just a really interesting community because of its very nature, being primarily text-based. And we've all seen the fuss now a few weeks ago about Twitter's lack of accessibility around video and some of that kind of stuff, and how they've just recently appointed an accessibility officer. I think it was really interesting, that community. If you put a shout out to a certain, and you tag it in a certain way, so Antonio, it's a really interesting way of mining a community really, really quickly. And I have a very good friend of mine, a guy called Drew Buddy, who's called Digital Maverick on Twitter, if you want to find him. But he describes it as his Google. He will quite often, if he wants something solving, he will actually just put it out on Twitter rather than Google it himself, which sounds very lazy, but I think you just get to hear a different range of voices. And that's quite an interesting one that Neil was talking about, is there are some tools that I just don't, some tools that I just don't use and don't know about, I occasionally look at Instagram. I've never used Snapchat in my life. It's just, I think you just pick up the tool that you want to use. And I think that interaction between tools is quite interesting, and how interoperable the tools are is quite interesting.
And what I often use the Twitter as a search engine, because it gives a more level of neutrality. It's less filtered than Google is. So I will end up with a set of results that don't get that algorithm filter that it gets on Google. And on the other end, I end up looking at people who have a particular interest on that topic, that I might have an interest on connecting, or I might have an interest, okay, let me see what this individual has been sharing over the last 4 or 5 days. Maybe there's something that I might want to discover that I was not aware.
The most fantastic one about that is just, things I wasn't aware. I've got a fantastic friend of mine, Adrian Higginbottom, who's Higgy on Twitter, who I discovered during lockdown had fell into the thing. I'm a bit of a baker in my spare time, so a bit of bread making, whatever. And like a lot of people, I started to do sourdough. It took too long, Neil, so I gave up, because it just takes too much time. So my wife started doing, but he's got a fantastic Twitter feed. He follows several people on Twitter with the hashtag baking blind, and it's people that are obviously blind and are baking, and it's just a fantastic community just to have a look at, dip into. And Adrian has an massive interest in technology, but he's also got an interest in baking, and that's just the eclectic nature of just things you find out through Twitter, I suppose, really.
Yeah. And tandem cycling, if I remember rightly.
It's tandem cycling. That's another one. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So, I think it's an interesting thing about technology. And yes, there are the sort of generational communities, and the sort of the migration from one platform from another as generations abandon stuff as the older generations come onto it. So you get onto Facebook now, and the kids are like, I don't want to be on there because my parents, and now even grandparents, are on Facebook, and they've moved to TikTok and on Instagram and Snapchat. So that said, I do think that there is still that cross-pollination across the social networks that's important. And what we don't want to do is end up in segregated silos.
And Antonio brings up a really interesting point about that algorithm filter, that whole filter about how you look at stuff. And even if you could compare it between search engines, and one of the things people used to think I had superpowers when I searched for stuff, because mainly because I can think of random things to put in a search box to link things together.
Yes.
You know, it's a bit like if you've lost a file on your PC, trying to think, well, what did I call it? And then just, and I think it's really interesting if you that filter, if you compare between a US, a UK based side of a certain search engine and an American one, or you go between the 2 or 3 major competitors, those differences in search are very marked, actually. And I think that's a really interesting one from a perspective of just, are we increasing our field of knowledge, or are we somehow narrowing it? I think it's just a really interesting. I think it's going to be one of the interesting things to look at in the next few years, really.
I've been in a kind of a pursuit for finding news in the technology space from other parts of the world. No, not because when we go basically to every site in the English language is frequently dominated by everything that happens in the United States. There are a few topics from the UK and sometimes from Ireland, but it's very difficult to tap into information that comes from other parts of the world. And I've been in the last couple of weeks trying to find tools, ways to tap into that type of information, because it's very difficult to find, and sometimes more relevant, more innovative, and more interesting than all the information that we get from Wired and from the traditional media outlets that cover technology in the United States.
I think there's some, again, I've got a bit of an interest in, I studied for 6 months in India after I finished my first degree in the mid 1980s. So, massively pre what we'd call the internet and email now. And I think what's interesting, if you look, and it goes back to our SMS conversation earlier, I think the way that SMS has been using in connection, I want to say communities at the edge of connectivity. So ones that are, and it's a bit like the parts of the States were a few years ago, when you had great internet connectivity in the cities, but as soon as you moved out into rural areas, that changed. And that how people interact with information, and it is almost like an asynchronous way that you're in connection sometimes, and you're out of connection sometimes. A bit like using a mobile phone in parts of the UK or parts of London even. But I think that's just an interesting one. And I do think that innovation often happens at the edge, not the centre. And I lived in New Zealand in the 1990s for a couple of years, and I realised how European-centric our news is, and I think you're quite right. It is, and the internet is just a massive North European, North American filter. It appears at times. And if you don't, everybody on this call will realise that's just a minute part of the world population.
I think also one of the interesting things is the way that you set up your tools can really affect. If you use them by default in their default settings, they're going to feed you stuff that's filtered through the algorithm. For whether that be Facebook or Twitter. You can turn off the Twitter one, and one of the things that I really loved about Twitter was the fact that it was unfiltered.
Yeah.
The only filter was the human being that had chosen the people to follow, right? And so you can set up all of these lists and so on, and if you're in TweetDeck, you can still have all of these different topical lists, and end up with this sort of stream of consciousness of stuff which is completely unfiltered. And I think that's really good in terms of combating bias and starting to see stuff that hasn't been sort of pre-chosen from you because of your geolocation and your previous search history, or something that people want to sell you.
And I think I think going back to the inclusion, I think that's really important with the inclusion and accessibility stuff, because it's really interesting about, if you look at the models of social models of disability, etc. And I think it's just really interesting sometimes just to have a look at somewhere where things are just viewed through a different, I think the phrase I use is a different lens, really. And I think sometimes you need to be, I watched a very, quite an old, I think it was Danish TV advert looking at basically looking at inclusion. I'll put it in the chat on Tuesday. I will find it for the Twitter chat. But it basically was, oh, that's interesting, and I wouldn't, and I got forwarded that by somebody who just said, you're going to find this interesting, and I just would never have come into my field. And it was just an interesting way of just looking at things in a slightly different way, really. I think technology is coming next is an interesting one. I've got everybody asks me what's coming next. I think the tools were really, there's some interesting stuff happening, but I think the real thing is around the whole use of data and how we have control of our own data, maybe, but also how we can filter data and how we can look for, or how we can use it and how we can curate it. I'm really slightly disheartened in some ways by my memory isn't as great as it used to be, if I'm really honest. And the fact is how you tag and how you curate stuff within Twitter. Think, where did I see that? Did I see that on Twitter? Did I see that X, Y, and Z? And I think that's really interesting, how we try not to lose some key facts. Because in the old days, I'd just, I don't know, I'd have bookmarked RSS feeds or something along those lines. And I just don't do that anymore. And that's quite sad, I think, really. And I think I could do some tools that allow me to curate or augment my memory. And I think that's quite an interesting area of development. And that might feed in, you were talking earlier about one of your future people were talking about care robots and stuff like that. And I think that whole idea of how you have a digital assistant. And I'm on my bio, I'm on record of saying, I always describe the mobile phone as it's like, the device to rule them all. It's not, but it is absolutely, it is like the communicator on the Star Trek Enterprise. I use it as a life support system. That's my main tool for cheating with dyslexia, my mobile phone. I use a diary extensively. I use voice to text extensively, and it just allows me to become digitally organized. I was really shocked a few years ago, and I was talking to a lady called Gráinne O'Connell, who's an academic, and she was talking about kids being digitally chaotic rather than digitally organized. And I thought that was an interesting phrase, and I wasn't sure she was right, but she was saying that you were more likely, if you had a child or a young person, to have an account, and if you lost the account password, you were more likely to make a new account than you were to bother to reset the password. And I just thought, whoa, that was it. And I thought, no, that's not true. And I think sometimes maybe it is true. I don't know.
I've fallen foul of that, in fact. So I've done that on at least one account where after the fact we've tried to merge the accounts, and it's had interesting effects. So I can apply settings in my sole remaining account because the other one has been supposedly deleted. So I've turned off email alerts and everything like that. You check it, and as they're all turned off, I still get emails. I still get all of the things.
It's living somewhere.
It's living somewhere on a server still, because they've merged the two accounts and they haven't sort of deleted it properly. Because they're not trying to deliberately spam me, because my wife has an account with the same company and the settings work for her. It's because I've created an account, forgotten about it, abandoned it, created a new one, and tried to merge it after the fact.
And I think from a collective memory, that tools and that curation and that thing you were just all talking about is really an interesting one, because they often say that we are the generation that's going to take the most photographs and potentially leave the least the most photographs in history, and make the least and leave the least evidence around, depending on how we archive our photographs, how we backup devices, whether we throw mobile phones away, drop them down the toilet or whatever, or into the bucket of water and washing the car, or that kind of stuff. And I think that's quite an interesting one. How there's going to be a whole area around digital forensics and all of those things. I think also help with again, feeding back into the AI with accessibility stuff. I mean, I think there's some whole things about AI being used as a predictive tool for conditions that are maybe when you're spotting things that you maybe would miss yourself, and that's a whole area of medical care which I think is going to be really interesting.
100%. So that sort of prediction and memory stuff is kind of exciting to me, a little bit scary also, depending on where it goes, who owns that data, but we definitely need it, because the volume of information is so great that it's unmanageable without some kind of help. We've reached the end of our time. Thank you very much.
Cool.
It's been a real pleasure, as always, talking with you, Andy.
Thank you very much.
To thank our supporters, MyClearText, Barclays Access, and Microlink for continuing to help us keep the lights on, stay captioned, and stay on it. So thank you again, and we'll see you on Twitter on Tuesday.
Okay, thank you very much. That cool?